Off the back of the success of John Carpenter's Halloween, there was a boom of teen horror movies through the 1980s, many of which focused on a group of teenage girls being menaced in their home by a deranged stranger. One of the most interesting of these teen splatter movies was The Slumber Party Massacre, a film which, due to Roger Corman's producing, included much of the schlock and male gaze that one might come to expect from this subgenre, but also, being written and directed by women, it was doing something smarter and more subversive that audiences might have initially expected.
Go away! Leave me alone, please!
Meanwhile, 10 years later, in the early 90s, director Fred Woolton decided to cash in on the glut of teen horror movies that had dominated the previous decade by making a long-awaited sequel to his 1979 classic, When a Stranger Calls.
I don't think you're alone in this house. Someone's upstairs. I've seen them moving around through the windows.
This was a cheap, made-for-TV sequel about a young girl being stalked whilst babysitting, and it didn't appear to bring anything new or interesting to the table. But with its returning cast members and Fred Woolton's incredible control of pacing and tension, it's since become considered among horror fans to be one of the most chilling and fun horror sequels of the 1990s.
He's in there with you. Look into the living room.
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss the Slumber Party Massacre and When a Stranger Calls Back. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion movies, and this is part 13. This week, as that intro suggested, it's a really fun pairing. We are going to be talking about 80s slasher classic, The Slumber Party Massacre, and early 90s not so classic, When a Stranger Calls Back. So joining me to discuss these two brilliantly weird movies, I've got a brand new guest. You may recognise him as a regular contributor on Stevie Webb's Brain Rot podcast, and it's a pleasure to finally get him here at EOH HQ. And there he is. It is my great pleasure to welcome Matt Draper. Hello, Matt.
Hey, Mike.
Hello. Come on in out of the cold. Matt, welcome to my slumber party. Make yourself comfortable.
We braid each other's hair later?
Yeah, we're gonna order pizza, prank call some people, get fully naked in front of each other, as apparently this is what people do in slumber parties, you know?
Only if there's a pillow fight, Mike.
Yeah.
That's conditional.
Yeah, exactly. So before we get into the films, this is your first time on the podcast. Just
Sure.
For people who don't know you, Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, that kind of thing.
Oh, man, Mike, I was just saying to you, this is really surreal for me because I am kind of, I find my way here first and foremost by being a fan of the show. So that's kind of how this has come about. We met through indirectly a event that Stevie, friend of the pod, from Brain Rot, of course, he put on a screening event of Friday the 13th a couple of years ago.
That's right.
And off the back of that event, I got to meet Stevie. I was fortunate enough to hit it off with him and he invited me onto his show. So I'm on there now kind of every month covering Future Frights. We do a segment where we talk about some upcoming horror or horror adjacent sometimes, depending on how busy the month's been in that way. But
have you noticed as well, because we've noticed this a bit, that like the kind of new horror stuff on Shudder and stuff is getting slimmer and slimmer and fewer and further between, isn't it? It's quite sad.
It's really
after
slowed
such a strong
down.
year last year.
We had a really big start, and not just in streaming, but like a really big start to the year with some really big theatrical releases, some big franchise releases with Scream, Evil Dead, and now it feels like we've kind of hit a slight lull before things pick back up. I know what you mean about Shudder, though. Yeah, it's definitely taken a bit of a someone's hit the brakes, haven't they?
Yeah, I know. It's really, really sad because it felt like it was going really strong last year, and I'm like, oh no, I hope Shudder aren't in danger of disappearing at some point.
That would be heartbreaking.
But yeah, I enjoy listening to yours and Stevie's reviews on that every month, and especially because you do have to talk about some quite bad stuff as well, don't you? Which is always quite fun. Like this, I was just listening to your like May one, the one that just went out, and some of that stuff, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna steer clear of all of this.
Yeah, and you know, even if the films are shit, then hopefully it provides some guidance to the listener to, you know, not waste their time on things. So that's exactly. If that's what we can bring,
you're doing a service. You're sitting through these things so we don't have to, Matt. So thank you for that. And tell us a little bit about your kind of horror origin story. Do you sort of remember when you first fell in love with the genre?
I can't remember a time when I wasn't in love with the genre. Yeah, it seems like this was almost from conception. I born in '87, so very much at what was kind of the runoff or the just after the peak slasher boom of the 80s. It was just prevalent everywhere, wasn't it, at that time? And I think as a kid of like the early 90s, I also find that we were really spoiled by being, you know, commercially targeted by big toy corporations, but with quite dangerous horror related stuff. So it was this stuff that always drew me from a really young age. Like, do you remember things like Monsters in My Pocket or Mighty Max?
That rings a bell. Yeah, I mean, I remember Mighty Max very well.
Of course. I mean, it was Polly Pocket for boys, wasn't it? But it was all horror, you know, themes. You'd have little skulls that you could open up and they'd have like mountainous toy designs in them. And all this stuff was around at that time. So it kind of started there. I was just always infatuated and fascinated by the macabre. The VHS store then became a big deal for me as I got old enough to really appreciate that. And the local VHS store that we had was it had a really interesting floor plan where all of the horror films were kind of kept out the back with like the porn. So there was immediately something like really shameful about just being stood in that section. Like people would be judged, you know, and I would be drawn to it and the horror and a part of that segment because of all the obvious things, you know, the artwork and that poster design, the VHS covers that was just geared to us.
Yes.
One of the things that I really remember when I was a kid was the fairground. Again, that kind of really dangerous space that was very alluring. And some of the rides at our travelling fair were always painted up in horror kind of franchise designs. So we had a ride called the Freddy's Revenge that would turn up and it had like all this kind of facade which had actual kind of replicas of the VHS artwork. And as a kid I had no idea what it was, who Freddy was, but I just would sit there and stare at this stuff like this is terrifying, but I cannot take my eyes off of it. And then as I got old enough to really become aware of who these characters were, and, you know, I would, having not seen the films, I would make up stories about them and I would tell my friends about Freddy Krueger and I would tell them that he was gonna get them in their sleep. And, you know, my mum would be on the other end of many angry phone calls from parents when I'd done so and their kid couldn't sleep in their own bed anymore. They kept coming into theirs. So, you know, it's really been, you know, it's not a unique trajectory, is it? But I've gone from kind of obsession to, you know, lifestyle now and now even to almost it's just a part of my identity, you know. On my bios it kind of comes under who I am. This is what I do. I love horror. It's just as much ingrained as part of my soul and body. So
Oh, I love that. I love that. What is your favourite? Obviously, horror is so broad. Do you have a particular favourite kind of subgenre, favourite era of movies? What do you kind of tend to gravitate towards?
It's tough. I am quite an obsessive but changeable person. So I will go through very short, concentrated bursts where I'm like, all I want to watch is something really specific. All I'm into is J-horror, or all I'm into is, you know, French extremity. And then I'll kind of move on to the next thing. But I always find myself comfortably slipping back into anything from like the 70s and the early to mid 80s, that's kind of my zone of where I just will naturally gravitate to if I don't know what to chuck on, because it's easy and it's comfortable. And I think, stuff from that time maybe resonates with a more childish part of me, because it's an era with without the technology that we have now. It's a simpler time.
Absolutely.
Through rose-tinted glasses, of course. So
yeah, absolutely agree with you. And yeah, I'm the same. Like, I do definitely, that's partly where this kind of podcast came from, because I do kind of tend to obsess over one particular type of horror.
Oh, yeah.
And then move on to the next one, which is kind of exactly what I do. And then I'm like, right, this year I'm going to talk entirely about zombie movies, and then I completely exhaust myself with zombie movies and move on to something different, right?
Yeah.
And so right now, obviously, I'm sort of all about home invasion movies and kind of variations on home invasion, which has been really interesting to ask different guests about, because people have very polarizing opinions on home invasion. What are your thoughts, Matt, on kind of classic home invasion movies? Yeah, that's usually the reaction. Yeah.
Honestly, I think this is one area that I just haven't spent much time immersing myself in. And even some of the real biggies that I probably should have seen, I've got some blind spots around here. I've never seen Funny Games all the way through. The Strangers, I didn't see The Strangers until like maybe 5 years after it came out. I just watched it on streaming somewhere. So some of these, like the kind of in their purest form home invasion movies, I just was never really drawn to. And I think when I try to understand why that might be, it's probably because sometimes it just can veer a bit too far into meanness for the sake of meanness, When we're at, people just being broken into and tied up and tortured, that doesn't do a great deal for me. And I don't find it that scary, because I just find it, like, sometimes a bit too, I don't know, it just doesn't connect with me.
I totally know what you mean. I think at their worst, they're just a bit boring sometimes, I think. Like, home invasion movies at their absolute worst, you know, when it is just a bunch of people tied up in a basement being tortured or whatever it might be. It's not scary and thrilling in the way that a lot of horror fans might want, I think, right? If anything, it's just a bit grim, Yeah.
They don't always allow for a huge deal of progression, either be that character progression or story plot development, because they're often refined to this one space, which I love a chamber piece, but if it is just about people at home, people come in, bad things happen, some of them may survive, some of them may not, nihilistic ending a lot of the time.
Yes.
There's not much of a journey to go on. It's just grueling, isn't it?
Agreed. And I think that's what's been quite fun about this series that I've been sort of doing, because I haven't really stuck to kind of very traditional home invasion, but I have gone more, I mean, you just said it just then, my chamber pieces, right? I feel like more what I've gone towards is kind of single location horror films set in the home or in a domestic space. And actually, when you branch it out into that, there's some incredible stuff. Yeah. And it does kind of bleed into slasher movies or kind of Hitchcock thrillers or, psychological movies and these kind of things. And I think then there's kind of some fun territory to cover, right?
100%.
Which is what makes it a bit more interesting and fun.
Yeah. And what I love about your application of this, the definition for this series, it's really opened it up to so many films that I either maybe would never have seen or have been wanting to watch, and is really given me reason to now. So, Sunset Boulevard, whatever happened to Baby Jane? Fantastic. Yeah. And maybe not one that you would naturally fit under this subgenre, but it really works. And then, of course, stuff like the ones we're going to talk about today, which again, maybe I wouldn't have thought of under this quite... Well, one of them I definitely would have, but maybe one of them I wouldn't have. So
Totally agree. And I think that, that's always the fun to be had, I think, because, horror genres, subgenres, it's all just like they're created by fans anyway, really. Like, these kind of boundaries don't actually mean anything, right? So I think it's fun to kind of explore that and push that. Have you ever, this is something I've been asking people too, but have you ever experienced anything of a kind of home invasion or break-in yourself, Matt?
So, yes, I have. And I've kind of got two different timelines of my life where this has been prevalent. So when I was a kid, I used to live in Devon and kind of in the sticks. Not by any means like a house in the middle of nowhere, but we were in a small community. And when I was 5, my house got broken into and burgled, kind of in broad daylight. And my mum and I were out. My brother was off like at a camping Cub Scouts retreat, and my dad was in the Navy working abroad. So it was just my mum and I when she returned home to find that the back door had been jimmied and someone had been in. And the house hadn't been ransacked. Nothing had been like massively damaged. They'd stolen all of my mum's jewelry. They'd stolen some valuable items, some obvious things that they could fit in their pockets, like cameras and smaller things without getting too noticed by, carrying a TV down the street or something. And it's funny. My mum says the moment she opened that door, while there were no visible signs that anything had happened, she knew people had been in our house. And
God.
Obviously, at my age, I was too young to really fully appreciate what was going on. But it's left its mark on me now to this point where I'm very, very cautious about keeping things locked. I will not leave my house to go and walk into my back garden without locking the front door.
Right.
If I'm alone in there, no one else is there. That's been kind of an event that's stuck with me.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's, and even something that is relatively subtle like that, in terms of, the house wasn't trashed, a few things were missing. There's something about that that's even more frightening and insidious, I think, right? But it's just the idea that somebody has just been in and has done that, maybe premeditated and then has left again. It is such an invasion, isn't it? Yeah.
And then after that, I moved to Brighton and I lived in really, really central Brighton in a maisonette. So in my adult years, for 15 years, I lived in this place alone. And I had a front door directly facing out onto the street, which was kind of a back alley in a very kind of well-populated area. And it used to be a bit of a passing route for people at the end of nights out. So I would always have people running by drunkenly, banging on the door, leaning on the door, stopping to have a chat. Once I was in my own kitchen and I could hear people, and I used to never go out and confront people because I was terrified of what they might be, what they might say to me, telling them to get away. And once I could hear the noise and I looked down at the crack of the door and someone was urinating against my door and it was trickling through.
Fuck. Oh, God.
And that was when I realised I'd had enough of living in central Brighton.
a home invasion of bodily fluids. That's its own kind of frightening, isn't it? Oh my God, I love it. And that is so often the case, right? When you live in a city, it's most likely that these kind of encounters happen in the middle of the night, usually with just somebody really drunk, right? As well, that tends to be what happens. Somebody's accidentally walked through the wrong door, or has leant on a door, or has pissed against the door, or something,
Yeah, accidental circumstance ones, but it's, you just don't know as the person behind closed doors wanting to know what's trying to get in. Do you confront that, or is that going to create a worse situation?
God, there we go. Well, it is that's the thing. I think that's the other thing about home invasion, is that everyone has a story like that, everyone has an experience, and I think it does tap into something very, very real at its darkest, doesn't it? And I think that's also why maybe it's not always the most fun thing to want to sit down and watch when you want a bit of escapism, right? It's not quite the same as watching a ghost story or a slasher movie or something like that, but
definitely.
But having said that, we are going to talk about a movie that is very, very fun. A couple of films that are very, very fun, actually, that kind of sort of semi-fit into this home invasion space. So let's begin. We're going to start by talking about early 80s slasher classic, Slumber Party Massacre from 1982, a movie that I feel like I've been wanting to cover on this podcast for ever. So it's so nice to have an excuse to properly talk about it. Now, Matt, I always get my guests to give me a little plot synopsis because I am terrible at doing plot synopses. So if you don't mind, set us up. Give us a little brief summary of what Slumber Party Massacre is all about.
Sure. So at surface level, face value, this is kind of your classic textbook American 80s slasher. So when her parents are going away for the weekend, high school girl Trish makes the most of having the house to herself by inviting her girlfriends over for the titular slumber party. Bad luck, There's a maniacal mass murderer on the loose from the local psych ward, slaughtering people with his giant power drill, which may or may not double up as a symbolic representation of his penis. And more broadly, it could represent men, the patriarchy, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Body count, pile up ensues, horror climax.
Yeah, that's it, right? It's kind of exactly what the title would suggest. It does what it says on the tin, right? Tell me a little bit about your sort of history with this film, Matt. When did you first discover it, and what do you think of the film generally?
So, not too long ago was my first watch of this. I think maybe it came about with the availability of a lot of these old, like 80s slashers on streaming. So I kind of watched this during a bit of a glut of, as I've aforementioned, get obsessive over these things. I was just probably binging loads of films from that period that I hadn't seen. So on my first watch, I gotta say, this didn't do a great deal for me. I kind of had a bit of awareness of it being lauded as a feminist film and having some quite progressive views for a slasher of that time. But it didn't provide me with anything like particularly exciting after watching films like, The Prowler and My Bloody Valentine and the rest of those kind of, Prom Night, some of those biggies. On rewatch, there is so much great stuff going on in this film, and I really did undervalue it. And I think what maybe gets it overlooked is that this is not a film maybe that thrills in the same way as some of those other ones. The death scenes aren't like super inventive. You don't have the practical effects work of like a Savini or a Screaming Mad George in this. It's all really serviceable and there's some good stuff, but part of the brilliance of this film is really more about its characters and the interactions. Yeah. And maybe what it's kind of saying, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, but what it's doing in a space that up until this point maybe hadn't been explored around generally just representing women.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a really interesting thing that the slasher movies kind of kicked off with very women-centric films. So, Black Christmas and even Halloween with Laurie Strode, these kind of really interesting female characters at the center of them. And then you got that boom of slashers in the early 80s where it kind of like mutated into something else, right? I feel like Friday the 13th, as much as I love it, probably has a lot to do with that, right? Where it kind of then becomes about tits and blood, essentially, right? And obviously, as you know, as so many of us know, like there were like 100 teen slasher movies that came out, across the next 2 years. Like 1980, 1981 was absolute peak teen slasher. And there are too many to like. I feel like I've seen hundreds of these, and I've probably still barely scratched the surface of these early 80s straight to video teen slasher movies. Right, Definitely. There are so many of them, but they all have that such a similar formula about them, don't they? I think, and the only way you differentiate them is: do some of them have better gore? Do some of them have better killers? Do some of them maybe have slightly better characters? Usually not. But I think what makes this one different is that it does actually kind of. It feels like one of the earliest kind of meta commentaries on these slashers in a way. It feels like it is prodding fun at the subgenre already, right? And we're only like 2 or 3 years into it at this point. It's this kind of push and pull that you have from probably the creative team, because we've got this female tag team of Amy Holden-Jones directing and Rita Mae Brown writing. And all of that comes through in the screenplay and the dialogue. You can see very much that this is a female-driven story. But then, of course, you've got the contradiction there of our exec producer, Roger Corman, behind it, screaming for more nudity, more TNA. So it kind of morphs into this hybrid where you can see where they were beholden to him and his vision, having to deliver some of that, but at the same time, sneaking in almost some stuff that's a little bit more empowering and a little bit more progressive. You're right. And it's a strange mix. I love this film, but I'm the same as you. I think it took me a couple of watches to fully appreciate it in that regard. I do think that on first watch, it does feel like a pretty bog standard slasher movie, really. Like, it, there's nothing particularly special about it, I think, until you kind of realise maybe some of this writing and some of these characters are a lot smarter than you initially give it credit for. But yeah, you're right. That Rita Mae Brown script that was picked up by Amy Holden Jones, and she'd been working in the industry for quite a while, I think, hadn't she? She'd worked for Corman. She had then been an editor. She had been edited movies by people like Scorsese, Spielberg, right? And so she was very much in the industry, wanted to make her directorial debut. She found this script. She made it with a bunch of like her own money, and she used some equipment borrowed from Joe Dante, apparently, from The Howling, because she was working with him. She made like a kind of taster tape for it, like a first 10 minutes of the film, and showed it to Roger Corman, and he was like, yeah, go and make it. But I think originally that idea was that it was going to be a parody of a slasher movie, right? It was going to be kind of having fun with the tropes and playing it for laughs entirely. And I think Roger Corman, like you said, with his kind of old school movie producer brain, was like, make it a slasher movie because that's going to make more money, throw in some tits, throw in some blood, keep it under 80 minutes or 90 minutes long, and so you get this weird mix, don't you, of like there is this kind of feminist slant to it and this kind of interesting subversion, but also it is still very much a conventional slasher film at the same time. I screened it last year, and it was really fun to watch it with an audience, and we did a panel afterwards with Stevie Webb and Becky Dark, and actually it was something that Stevie said that really struck me, which was that it's not a horror comedy or a horror parody. It's a straight up horror that also just happens to be funny, right? Like, and I think that's the difference. It's like, that's quite a fine line, but I think that's what it is. It's a straight slasher movie, but one that just happens to have funny characters in it. Yes,
and that's it, is the characters, aren't? Yeah, they have a sense of humour, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, but I think that's very much due to the characterisation of this core group of women.
Yeah, totally. What are your thoughts generally? Like, again, like, this isn't your classic home invasion movie, but I felt like I wanted to find at least one movie to talk about during this series where it does cross over into pure slasher, because I think there is this kind of thin line, especially at this point in time. It's almost like the home invasion movie, it became this post-Halloween, right? Halloween kind of was a home invasion movie that gave birth to the slasher movement, right? And so it felt kind of a good time to talk about one of these early 80s slashers. But what it's, by the sounds of it, Matt, you're a fan, are you? Are you a fan of the whole wave of kind of slashers that we got at this time? Your Sleepaway Camps and My Bloody Valentines and all of those movies.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I adore them. This was kind of like my gateway point to horror. So how could I not? I guess, maybe some of my trashier tendencies and leanings pull me more towards the post Elm Street slashers, as well. I love when they get really wacky and fantastical as well, and they get a bit silly, and they get to get really creative and playful with the format. So maybe that's more my preference. But I think there is so much kind of, even through the dregs of some of those, and you look at this, even Roger Corman produced 3 massacre franchises. There was this, there was the Sorority House Massacre, the Cheerleader Massacre, all with sequels. And within any of them, you can find moments of good stuff. And I think, if you track the kind of progression of them in the way that you are right now, it's very interesting to see where we end up with, Nightmare Part 6, Freddy's Dead, or Jason Goes to Hell, where we've got body swapping, and they're just kind of these ways to try and keep the genre, that subgenre, fresh and inventive, are really exciting, I think, even though sometimes the results aren't always great.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and I think maybe that's a good chance to start by talking about the killer in this too, because I think that is the one thing that kind of sets this apart a bit from your conventional slasher, and it feels more akin to a movie like When a Stranger Calls or some of these other home invasion films I've been talking about, because there is something a little bit more mundane about this killer, I think, right? He's not this this kind of really shadowy, terrifying figure in a mask that is barely human, that kind of walks and catches up with people and seems to keep coming back from the dead and all those other things. Like, it's just a bloke in double denim, right? And like, there's no whodunit mystery, there's no supernatural or kind of weird uncanniness about him in a way. He's just a bloke, right? But what do you think of the killer in this movie, our sort of driller killer, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly what you say. He is just a man. And of course, that's what the film is highlighting. You know, this is just a man. The threat is coming from just another human being. They may have different reproductive organs to the victims he's stalking, but there is nothing that is particularly surprising about him. He doesn't have any quips. He doesn't, like you say, he doesn't have a standout gimmick or anything about his look that you can really attribute to, is he ever going to be a Halloween costume? I don't know. I don't think I see ever people doing, Russ Thorne from Slumber Party Massacre. So there's something a little bit pathetic about him. And even throughout the movie, he's silent, but towards the end, we get this moment where he speaks. And he speaks with it's very chilling, actually. It actually almost makes him scarier, that moment, I think, because of perhaps what he's saying. But his voice himself, there's nothing intimidating about him. He's not in a great booming voice or, this isn't the voice on the other end of the phone in When a Stranger Calls.
Oh, my God. No.
Talking in breathy kind of, sexual tones. It's none of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, completely agree. There is something, like you said, pathetic is the perfect way to put it. There is something a little bit pathetic about him. And again, I think we'd had this boom of slasher movies by this point where so many of them became more about the killers than the victims, right? And the victims or the protagonists were kind of cardboard cutouts, and people were there more to see the kills than the killer. And I do feel like this movie kind of brings that back a little bit more, and it makes it about the characters that we actually like and we want to root for. And this killer, it doesn't really spend any time on at all, right? And I think in that regard, it does feel like more like a classic home invasion movie in some of the ones I've covered previously to this, like a Wait Until Dark or a Fright, or these movies that are more focused on the women in the home having to survive it, I suppose, right? So I think that's a kind of interesting thing that sort of makes it stick out from that glut of early 80s slashers in that regard, right? It's less about the slasher himself, I guess, What about then, I want to ask you about this kind of sort of male gaziness, I suppose, because it's weird, right? There is a kind of female gaze to this film, but also a kind of male gaze to this film. I think, would you know necessarily that this movie was made by women if you didn't know that going in? Because, within like the first 10-15 minutes, you've got like very, very lingering shots of these women's butts and breasts in the showers, right? And everything. But yeah, what do you make of that and the direction here?
That shower scene is a prime example, because what you've got in this is, I think, again, at face value, you wouldn't necessarily know that this is written and directed by women. I don't think, because you just look at some of the camera and the visual language is telling you this is leering over these women. The shot you mentioned in the shower, we're watching the heads and then we pan down to a great woman's bum close up and then pan back up again. And it's so obvious. It's almost bordering on like satire, because it just feels like, you wouldn't see that in any other genre unless it was maybe an erotic film, perhaps.
Yes.
But the beauty of that scene in the shower room is that it is in actual fact the dialogue that is in complete odds with what the camera is doing. And it's in essence a lad's locker room scene. We've got these women post-game. Might I add, basketball is their game. They're not netball players, This is a game that maybe at the time was less commonly played by women. I don't know about now. I don't know the popularity of women's basketball teams, but it feels like that's a very deliberate choice, isn't it? To give them that as being their core sport of interest. They're really athletic women. They're in the showers. They're talking about football games. They're also really in control and owning their sexuality. They're talking about their feelings towards men, the football players in the last night's game. And they're kind of objectifying these men through the way they're discussing them. And it's like a bunch of lads, going, oh, she's a bit of all right, isn't she?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's it.
Yeah.
They rib each other on their performance in the game. So, we've got all of this going on while the camera is telling us, oh, look at this, ooh, naked ladies. But in actual fact, they're just they're not interested. And we see this again later in a scene where at the slumber party itself, the ladies undress, and at no point are they being performative or behaving sexually. Compare this shower scene with something like the opening scene of Carrie, and this isn't the gauzy kind of, women slow motion running around, everything's jiggling, slapping each other with towels. That's not that. It's very matter of fact. And they get undressed, they wash themselves, they get dressed again in front of each other. They don't bat an eyelid. They're not all bending over. Oops, look what I've dropped. It's none of that. It's the camera and the viewer that's being leering, really. We're the ones that are staring them up. And it kind of makes us ask ourselves, oh, what? Why am I doing that? This isn't cool.
Do you know what? That's such a good way to put it, because you're absolutely right. I think that you're right. They are not acting in any kind of like weirdly sexual way, or a way where it's like, oh, these are women on film doing their thing. Like you said, they're acting very naturally. And I think those lingering shots are a brilliant example of how smart I think Amy Holden-Jones is as a director, because I think you're right. Like, obviously she was putting that stuff in there because Roger Corman probably wanted it, and because it was kind of slightly kind of playing into the tropes of the slashers. But I think you said it yourself, like, it almost leans into parody at just how leery it is. And I think it does. Like, that shot of starting on the head and working its way slowly down the body and literally just pausing on the tits, pausing on the arse for so long, it goes beyond just being a bit leery and titillating, and it almost does make you go, why am I looking at this still? Yeah. Right? Like, I think it does, like, in a very subtle, smart, subversive way. I think she's deliberately holding that camera for so long that it does push it almost into absurdity, where we are questioning, what are we looking at and why are we looking at this, And that is, I think, really interesting and smart.
Yeah, you want to be turned on? I'll let you get turned on. Here you go. Look how much time you've got. Yeah. Like, is that enough for you? Do you want some more? That's what she's saying.
And what about the characters themselves? There are a lot of them, right? And we'll go into, obviously, we've got our kind of core group of friends. We have the other girl, the new girl, who's kind of the outsider, right? And there's some really fun stuff with her and her sister in the house across the street as well, right? But what do you think of our sort of core group of characters generally?
Yeah, I think they're great. They're really, it's really nice, because what we've got is just a great representation of sisterhood. And there's a bit that I love where they're very respectful of one another. It's honest in that not everyone gets along, and we have Valerie, the character who lives across the road, who doesn't get invited to the party, very obviously, because some of the other girls are jealous of her because she's really beautiful. Yes. Maybe they don't want her compromising their chances with some of the boys that they're interested in, but it's just very honest. They gas each other, they play with each other a little bit, they poke fun at each other. But when they are all faced and they realize what they're actually dealing with, that there is someone stalking the house, they kind of unify. They're all really capable. They're all really brave, courageous, resilient women and resourceful women. And, you can't talk about the women in this film, the female characters, without talking about the men, who there are less of, but they are the complete opposite of that. They are wet. They cannot look after themselves. They are scared. They at this mere suggestion of there being a killer, they say, let's run for it. Let's make a run and get out of here. Do they give a toss about the women? No. In the scene prior to that, we've got a phone call with the female coach of the basketball team, who gets cut off on the call, worried about the girls. She says, I'm going to make my way over there on my own. So that stark contrast, just one scene to the next, of here's a woman who is willing to go into this situation on her own to make sure that these girls are okay. And these two boys who are there with them right now are going to fuck off and leave them behind.
Yes.
It really is. It's playful. Again, it's funny because it is kind of subverting our expectations of gender roles, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. And a lot of those boys, you know, they're in it for like one scene and then they get offed early on, right? And that tends to be the role of the girl in those sorts of films as well, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There's some really interesting kind of subversion and gender flipping and that kind of thing. And yeah, I think all of the girls in this are brilliant. I think they're, you know, even though not all of them have a huge amount to them, right? They are kind of still a bit archetypal, I suppose, but I think they're played really well, and I think the banter between them works, that it's actually quite a joy to watch. I find some 80s slashers, you tend to just be a bit like, okay, get on with it, let's get to the next kill, right? Like the kind of talky bits in between usually tend to be the bits that no one really gives a shit about. Whereas I think, again, this movie, it does spend time with these girls, and the stuff between them is actually genuinely quite fun, even, and the horror is almost kind of, I don't know, takes up less space in the film in a weird way, right? It's less about the big splattery kills, and it is more about these girls and their relationships to each other. Yeah.
No, I think you're so right. And it almost, in some ways, it feels like it doesn't really all escalate until like the last 15 minutes, where that's actually where the home invasion itself kind of happens, right? Because before that, the killer is just really stalking the perimeter of the house and like this in-between space between the two houses that we're kind of following. So all of that stuff before, it just zips along, and it never once feels like it's baggy or just trying to like clunkily develop characters so you care for them. You genuinely do for the most part, I think. They're just a joy to watch.
I really love the girls across the street, especially the younger sister, the weird...
Courtney,
the horny younger sister, who also, by the way, looks like she's about 30 in this film, but I think she's supposed to be really young, right? Who's like caught watching, like looking at some porn and like all that.
She's
stuff.
in the Playgirl mag, isn't she? Yeah.
Like, again, how often do you see a girl reading a Playgirl mag in a movie of this era, right? As well, it's brilliant.
It's really honest though, isn't it? Because it's letting the girls get the autonomy over their sexuality. They have agency in being able to feel lustful thoughts towards men. And I mean, what I love about that is that we've got Sly Stone in his younger years on the cover of Playboy.
Yes.
And I think there's that line, you know, make sure you don't rip out the centerfold this time. Oh, too late. Yeah.
I love it. It's great. Like that kind of stuff. Again, like, that doesn't necessarily need to be in this film, really, that stuff. But that is what kind of, I think, makes this film stand apart. It's just, it gives it that bit of fun and texture and character, you know?
Totally, yeah.
And the horror itself then, what do you think of these kills? You know, all done with this big old phallic drill. Again, like, it's not subtle in its symbolism. There are so many shots from, like, between the killer's legs as he's holding this drill.
Oh, iconic.
Like, coming towards these women. It's absolutely hilarious, right? But what do you think of the horror, the gore, the kills themselves?
It's good. I don't think there's anything particularly stand out or remarkable about some of them, but we do get a good diverse, you know, for what you're looking for a slasher. It's not all just, you know, generic stabbing or generic drill kill. You know, you have got a few ways of mixing it up. They, you know, throw in a decapitation here. Someone gets a drill through the top of the head, another through the neck. So, you know, there's enough variety to keep any kind of gorehound satisfied, I suppose. I think what's more interesting to me is perhaps trying to find some kind of reading of the kills and what the killer's motivation could be. And I think it's really interesting because I don't know if this necessarily plays over the entire film, but certainly some of the earlier kills feel to me like they are very purposeful and intentional about who is being killed off and why, and kind of the things the symbolism of what's going on screen. Take, for example, the first person to die. Within the first 5 minutes, we have our phone repair lady, who is very lesbian coded. Okay, she's wearing a tool belt. She's up a ladder. How is that not lesbian coding? Okay, it's a bit shallow, but you know, that's what I got from it.
Absolutely.
And she's the first person to be offed. We then next find a I can't remember the name of the character, but the girl who gets killed in the locker room. We have a chase sequence, which she's then wounded and is bleeding out, and we find her trying to staunch her wound with a white towel. And for me, I'm reading this as something in the way of perhaps, is he is the intention behind the killer to satirize the male's selection process for a suitable mate. Okay, so we've got first woman off, not suitable, not into men, you're not going to work.
Yeah.
The next one, you're not. That is to me a symbolic menstruation scene, because
yes, right.
We then have the blood trickling out through the door, underneath the door, much like the urine of my old house, and then and the killer looks down, spots the blood, and that is what then leads him to her to commit the kill.
Yes.
Later, we have the other character who gets killed when she's trying to make out with her boyfriend. She goes back to the car to get busy with him, and his head's been severed. She gets she gets the drill through her. So, again, she's taken, she's not available, so the killer can't have her. What he wants is to possess these women, right? And any of them that he cannot possess get crossed off the list. But then it gets a bit more confusing towards the end, because you kind of feel like he wants to save them all. He's collecting the bodies as well. And what we're left with maybe the few more viable options for him to...
I love that. I think that's such a good reading of it. It's so true, because of course, his few lines of dialogue are, I love you and stuff, right? As well. Like, he does obviously clearly sexually want these women as well, right?
I know you want it too. Oh, chilling. Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely chilling, yeah. And of course, and Amy Holden-Jones has talked about this as well, that it's also about kind of women's fears of men and losing their virginity to men at that age and that kind of thing. And so it kind of goes both ways in that regard, that it's this horrible predatory man going, I love you, I know you want it too, and all of that stuff, right? I think it does. It kind of works both ways in that regard.
Of course. Yeah. And the whole film is filled with this burgeoning sexuality. Right from the beginning, the opening frame is of Trish, one of the leads, putting away her toys, right? She's binning some of her childhood teddies and dolls. And, it's very much time to put away childish things. As the old quote goes, isn't it? They are becoming women. And we see that at the older teenage level. We see that again with Courtney, the younger girl who's starting to develop feelings. And then this man comes in to fuck it all up, as we like to do, us men, right? It's absolutely.
And how do you find that kind of final act, that sort of home invasion element? I do think there's some really fun moments here in the way that Amy Holden-Jones uses the space of the home, like the bodies in the fridge, or the kind of, there's one person, somebody's got like, is it a drill or a saw or something, but then they can't quite get where they need to go because it's plugged into the wall.
Yes.
It's like, I think there's some really fun little touches in that final act,
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Because up until this point, we've really not seen him inside the house. I think he's made his way into the garage, and the garage plays a role in quite a few scenes, this kind of like somewhat outside space. It's like the in-between your home. You wouldn't ever live in there. It's not a domestic space, but it's kind of a back entry, I guess, isn't it? So then interestingly, when he actually makes his way into the home proper, it is, of course, through the bedroom window of the girl, the teenage girl. And okay, here's one for symbolism. He enters drill first through the pink silky curtains. If this film were made now, those curtains would have been shaped like a vaginal opening, wouldn't they? But it's actually, this for me is where it does actually become scary. And there's something in this moment of him entering and them all realizing, holy fuck, he's actually in the house. And the way that scene is framed, it brings to mind to me something. I can't help but wonder if maybe Lynch was inspired by this for Twin Peaks or Fire Walk With Me. It's a Bob moment to me, entering the space of the teenage girl. And I can't not make that comparison. The grey-haired killer who
in double denim,
who in some locations or some contexts wouldn't be that scary at all, but because of the uncanniness of where he is and what he's doing there, how did he get there, it's actually fucking terrifying. So I think it's a really, it kind of, the stakes do evolve a little bit. They really do shoot up at this final 15-minute segment, and then, as you say, it's kind of all action from there.
I love that. That's that's a really good point, and I think you're right. There is something suddenly more tense and serious and scary about it when this man has kind of, so to speak, like penetrated the walls of this house and has found his way in, right? And again, like I think this idea of kind of home invasion, has for so long, for most of the films we've talked about up until the 70s, been adult women mostly. And I think now, since Halloween, you've got this wave of movies about teenagers and teenage girls. And teenagers are so interesting anyway, aren't they? Because they're sort of like, they're not children, but they're not quite adult. They're not a girl, not yet a woman, right? As Britney Spears once
yes.
said. And there is this feeling of like extra vulnerability, but also they are that kind of like independent enough to babysit children and to be alone in the house.
Yes.
But then what does that mean when a man enters and all of this kind of thing? So, and I love that also that the fun of this film, I suppose, is that the girls very much act as a group, at least until they're picked off. There is a lot of the three of them. When you think of all of the famous shots from this film, it's like the three girls together with weapons, like creeping around as a pack, as a unit, as opposed to one woman alone outnumbered in her house kind of thing. So I think that kind of gives it a kind of extra fun layer in that regard.
It's a really refreshing break from what we now know as some of those kind of slasher traditions. The kills aren't really being exacted in like the sense of a morality kills, because for the most part, some of these girls, yes, some of them have sex, some of them drink, some of them take drugs, but they're all targets irrespective of that. And and it really kind of doesn't really track to the final girl trope, because what we end up with is final girls, plural, which is a really cool kind of triumphant ending to this film, where we must talk about the obvious final moments as they take on the killer.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? And you're absolutely right about that it's not just one girl by herself. There isn't it's hard to kind of think of who our final girl or protagonist is in this. I think of them all collectively as one, right? But yeah, that amazing showdown at the end, the swimming pool and everything else, and castrating the drill bit, right? Incredible
Of course,
stuff.
Yes. They emasculate him with the drill bit, and how could they not? But you've got, we end on the three shots, one shot after another of these women's faces, traumatized by what they've been through, horrified, sobbing, but survivors and survivors together because they relied on each other. And awesome. Just at that point on sisterhood, I should have said this earlier, but it was the point where one of the girls is going to get some action, and she actually goes back into the house to ask her girlfriends whether it's okay if she ditches them so she can go get laid with her boyfriend in the car. And you just like, no slasher film with a guy doing the same thing does he ever do that. And it really does reinforce this sense of unity, and it's cool. It's really a positive message. Really at odds with what this film looks like it's going to be, because one of the things that might deter some viewers is that artwork, because it looks like it's going to be really sleazy, really exploitative, really nasty, horrible violence towards women throughout. And it doesn't really do that. You are so on the women's side throughout this whole film.
I think it's really fun. I think, again, the marketing is having fun with this film, right? You're absolutely right. It's like Amy Holden-Jones knows what she needs to put in this film to draw an audience of your typical quote-unquote slasher movie fans, maybe. And then once she lures you in, she finds fun ways to subvert it. And yeah, you're so right. And I love this idea of the kind of unity between them all. And just the little moments, like one of my favourite moments is when they're all sat together back to back waiting for something to happen, and there's the dead pizza boy just next to them.
Yes, I love
they're
this.
Suddenly like, I'm kind of hungry, right? And then they just like lean in to go grab some pizza that doesn't have blood on it from the dead pizza boy. Like, again, like those kind of moments I think are what really kind of makes this movie fun,
Is the pizza cold? No, but he is. They've got a sense of humor in pretty bad times. Like,
you know what? I'm hungry. Me too. What are we going to do with him? Maybe we should cover him up. He's dead, all right. No kidding. He's so cold. Is the pizza? Well, life goes on after all. And eating makes me feel best. When I feel bad, and boy, do I feel bad. Oh.
So good. We are going to wrap up on Slumber Party Massacre shortly, but first of all, let's head on over to a brand new Wild About Horror segment, because psychoanalytic cinephile Mary Wild has many thoughts on the Slumber Party Massacre.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Amy Holden Jones's The Slumber Party Massacre, which follows a high school student who gathers her friends for a sleepover, unaware that an escaped power drill-wielding killer is loose in the neighborhood. It was originally written as a parody of the slasher genre, but was shot as a straightforward horror film instead. As a result, it has more humor than usual for the genre at the time. Despite the mixed reviews from critics upon release, it went on to gain a large cult following. As the slumber party begins, the girls smoke marijuana and drink alcohol. Two boys from school arrive and spy through the window while the girls undress. Diane asks permission to step out with her boyfriend, goes to his car to find him decapitated, then is murdered herself. The pizza delivery man arrives with his eyes drilled out. The teens arm themselves with knives, but the driller killer manages to gain entry to the house. Let's recall the opening scene of Slumber Party Massacre. 18-year-old high school senior Trish wakes up in the morning and proceeds to remove toys and other objects from her childhood. The camera lingers on her body while she changes out of her sleepwear and into a day dress. We are invited to observe her physical change into an adult, from girl into woman. My view is that the film's essence hinges on the opening scene, a liminal interval bursting with change and possibility. The animating impulse of this subjective transformation drives the spirit of the film, compelling a voyeuristic response, not in a harmful, objectifying way, but rather we can say that it is a pure cinematic pleasure obtained through looking. Sure enough, the scenes that follow take place at the high school, where the camera leisurely persists in the girls' shower, filling the screen with shots of naked and dripping wet young women. This is not by accident. The abundance of female nudity serves an alluring function here. The shower scene reminds me of Hylas and the Nymphs, an 1896 oil painting by John William Waterhouse, depicting a moment from the Greek and Roman tragic legend in which the enraptured Hylas is abducted by the Naiads, female water nymphs. On an epic quest, Hylas was sent to find fresh water and discovered a pond occupied by Naiads. They lured him into the water and he disappeared. My proposition is that the emerging power of female eroticism in both the painting and the film is perceived as horrifically overwhelming, capable of swallowing up and erasing male subjectivity. And in a fit of desperation, some drastic action must be taken to curtail the danger it supposedly presents. In Slumber Party Massacre, this action comes in the form of the driller killer, conceptualized more as an abstraction than an actual human man, permanently in a position of combat against the alleged threat. The topography of the film is carefully constructed to shrink down the world from families, school, and community to the interiors of Trish's house. This inward movement hints to me that predominantly a psychological event is taking place here. Early on in the film, the mass murderer attacks a telephone repairwoman at the high school and fatally wounds her in the back of her van. This establishes the killer's initial motive: to shut down communication within the feminine register. Killing the telephone repairwoman symbolically invokes the silencing of female voices and removal of their access to the outside world. The film makes the slumber party experience look adventurous, fun, and carefree. It's a sweet slice of Americana, not meant to be overly serious, and the guests are doing everything except sleeping. There are wistful shots of the young women disrobing whilst casually chatting. The ambiance inside the house is easygoing, sensual, and playful. Some boys from the high school peer in excitedly through the window, but this is a psychologically female space, and the men are fleeting through it. They're just tourists, with the exception of one man who makes himself notable, the escaped mass murderer Russ Thorne. The driller killer reminds me of Bob from Twin Peaks. He's a double denim-clad, creepy home invader with a frozen, maniacal glare. As mentioned earlier, I see him as more of a nightmarish allegory or aesthetic energy than a real person. Thorne's weapon contains a taboo element, the power drill. Maybe as a Freudian I'm biased for saying this, but it's impossible to overlook the penis reference here. His name, Thorn, literally means a stiff, sharp-pointed, woody projection on the stem of a plant. This invokes a penetrative condition, saturated in the power drill, closing in on its targets and impaling them. But why should it matter that a drill-brandishing lunatic fixates on a girl's slumber party, killing the guests one by one? What is really going on here? Well, my perspective is that the teenagers in the film are curious about sex and open to experimenting. The drill piercing through them is an externalized, overstated fantasy which stands in for the real taboo, female sexual desire and enjoyment. The driller killer is the unprocessed, fearful element of sexuality that doggedly punctures society. And this touches on the second meaning to Russ Thorne's name, sex itself being a thorny issue, or a thorn on the side of these girls, a source of discomfort, annoyance, or difficulty, an irritation or obstacle. For whatever reason, whether it's the fear of physical pain in heterosexual intercourse or the indoctrination of women in a patriarchal society where there are sexist double standards around female desire, women are conditioned to feel ashamed for wanting to have sex. A lot of factors contribute to the idea of sexual intercourse as being something terrifying that can harm women. The driller killer is constantly lurking around, peeping through the window. He stalks these girls, never far from them. That is to say, sex is never far from their mind, but it's particularly the scary dimension of sex they're preoccupied with. It's also worth theoretically examining Jacques Lacan's notion of the imaginary phallus, which is perceived by the child in the pre-Oedipal phase as the object of the mother's desire, as that which the mother desires beyond the child. The child thus seeks to identify with this object. The Oedipus complex involves the renunciation of this attempt to be the imaginary phallus. Over time, the child slowly comes to realize that it is not identical to or the sole object of the mother's desire, as her desire is directed elsewhere. The child will thus attempt once again to become the object of the mother's desire and return to the initial state of blissful union. The imaginary phallus is what the child assumes someone must have in order for them to be the object of the mother's desire. And as her desire is usually directed towards the father, it is assumed that he possesses the phallus. Through trying to satisfy the mother's desire, The child identifies with the object that it presumes she has lost and attempts to become that object for her. The phallus is imaginary in the sense that it is associated in the child's mind with an actual object that has been lost and can be recovered. The Oedipus complex for Lacan involves the process of giving up the identification with this imaginary phallus and recognizing that it is a signifier and as such was never there in the first place. The logic of the imaginary phallus is established very early on in this film, in the driveway of the family home, just before Trish's parents drive off to their holiday. Here's what the mother, Annette, says before entering the car. Trish, the chips are under the sink, and the soda's in the fridge, and our number at the hotel is right by the phone. Mr. Content will be home all weekend, and he'll look in on you. You lock all the doors and windows. At this point, Trish is visibly annoyed and says, Mom, I'm 18 years old, remember? To which Annette replies, You'll always be my baby. My claim is that this last statement, you'll always be my baby, promises a rekindling of the initial maternal bond with her child, presenting it as eternal and unbreakable. It casts a certain spell, reactivating the imaginary phallus and inviting Trish to identify with her mother's desire, which in this case is the hope that Trish's eroticism remains under lock and key all weekend, closely monitored by their killjoy neighbor, Mr. Content, who is obnoxiously quick to embrace his deputy dad duty and glibly affirms, Don't worry, I won't let the girls get into any trouble. Trish internalizes her mother's desire, and in this context, unconsciously stages the shame associated with sex by casting Russ Thorne as a malevolent, penetrative entity obsessed with invading the wholesome family home and piercing innocent girls to death. The subtext being that when women engage in or enjoy sexual intercourse, they incur the risk of a social death. Until next time, don't get pierced out there.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on genre cinema and other topics, you can follow her on Patreon. Sign up over at patreon.com/Mary Wilde. Matt, we are going to wrap up on Slumber Party Massacre because we've got a whole other film to talk about, but I have to just finish by asking you, obviously this movie did have a couple of sequels and a remake, and just out of interest, I mean, I'm looking at you right now on camera and you've got an incredible Slumber Party Massacre 2 t-shirt on, so I've got to ask you, are you a fan of the sequels?
So, number 2, absolutely, and that is so a bit of me. It's it's, as I said earlier, like, I love anything where slashers go wacky, and number 2, we've got a rockabilly with a electric guitar with a drill bit on the end doing musical numbers.
Amazing.
It's
incredible.
It's insane. But I love it. I absolutely love it. I haven't seen number 3.
I haven't, no.
So I must correct that. No?
And there was a sort of reboot sequel a couple of years ago as well, which I actually haven't seen yet. Have you caught that one?
I brushed up on that in preparation for this. There's a bit of extra reading, and I really liked it. It's really fun. It's very, as you've not seen it, I won't say too much, but it is doing similar things to this one, maybe almost in a more heightened way. It is very much being pushed to the forefront, and down our throats, the kind of the gender subversion. But it's really clever, and it's really respectful of this one, and it has some nice little nods to the original and the sequel. So I would totally recommend it. You could do a lot worse out of modern remakes.
Love that. And so finally then, how do you think this original version, it's over 40 years old now at this point, how do you think it sort of holds up? Is it still a film that you'd recommend to horror fans today?
To horror fans, yeah, I definitely would. I think it has its part to play in genre history, doesn't it? So if not as you will love this, because I don't think it's not for everyone, but I do think you probably should see it just to appreciate, where slashers have come from. Would I, outside of genre fans though, I wonder if some of the stuff that it's doing and saying, maybe we're so adjusted to that as being the norm now. Would it really seem that interesting or pioneering? I don't know if people would appreciate what it's going for, just because we've had so many great women characters in stuff since. So, yeah. Yeah,
I know what you mean, definitely. I think it's probably partly what there is to appreciate is its context, right, of when it came out and what horror teen movies were like at the time. But I think in some ways it has aged. I feel like this film's reputation has grown and grown and grown. I feel like there is this love for it now that, I might be wrong, but I don't think really existed in the mid-80s, right? I feel like, again, like I've been to screenings of this in London. I've hosted a screening of this. People flock to this film and people love it, particularly female audiences as well. Like, right. I think it does really strike a chord in that regard, in the way that it's maybe it was underappreciated at the time or something. I don't know. I think it's just such a strange mix of that kind of, like you said at the beginning, that kind of Roger Corman leeriness with this kind of interesting feminist subversion. It's such a fascinating mix in that regard,
Well, it's amazing that it's getting that platform and that kind of reappraisal now, because it totally deserves it. And yeah,
there you go. So that's the incredible Slumber Party Massacre from 1982. Now we're going to move on to a even lesser known film, one that I had no idea about before coming to this season. We're going to jump forward 10 years to the golden age, 1993, to talk about When a Stranger Calls Back.
Go away! Leave me alone, please!
Listen to me very carefully. You don't live here, do you? You're just a babysitter. Have you been upstairs in the last 5 minutes?
Why?
I don't think you're alone in this house. Someone's upstairs. I've seen them moving around through the windows. You should get out of there. Now.
Once again, Matt, if you don't mind, set us up. Give us a little plot synopsis for When a Stranger Calls Back.
Oh, Mike, this one. I really found this hard. So we start with a very familiar setup to what we've seen in the previous When a Stranger Calls, the first time movie, as Stevie called it the other day, When a Stranger Calls One.
Yes.
So we've got our babysitter, Julia. She turns up to look after two children while the parents are out for the evening. Sounds very familiar so far. But this time, the harassment from a new stranger comes from someone at her front door who knocks to ask for assistance as his car's broken down and he's stranded. So we have like the first one, our opening short movie, 25 minutes of the film portion, which is purely taking place with this set piece. And the result of that back and forth, which we will have to go into more detail about,
we absolutely will. Yeah.
is that she escapes, she survives, the two children she was babysitting disappear, no trace. And the man ended up being, of course, inside the house with her. We jump to 5 years later, and this is where things get a bit strange. Julia's at college, living with the ordeal that she's experienced. When small signs of break-ins start to appear in her apartment, things get moved. Books are in different places from where she left them. Her alarm is set at a different time from when she left it. And she finds the clincher, a child's T-shirt hanging up in her wardrobe, which prompts her to take this to the police. Cue returning characters, Jill, played by the awesome Carol Kane, and John Clifford, detective, played by Charles Dunning from the original, who are here on site to support her. Jill is now the director of the Women's Services on campus. No mention, interestingly, of her family, parents or children, husband or children from the first one. But she seems to have adopted this new role in which she can help others who have experienced things like her. And the rest of the film kind of plays out with the three of them. They've joined forces to solve the mystery. They're navigating Julia, our babysitter's trauma, and also questioning her believability. How reliable is her story? How much of this could be PTSD? Or after a bit of back and forth on that one, all clues lead to the eventual and obvious conclusion that our stalker is a ventriloquist. So mere moments after this revelation, the call comes in. Julia's shot herself with the gun she was given to defend herself and is completely comatose, leaving it to Jill and John to all the J names in this film.
Yes.
Jill and John to track down and stop our stranger before he turns his attention to Jill for our eventual showdown in her own home.
What a bonkers story, Matt, right? What an insane... And this is something funny that I found last week with Stevie summarising the plot of the first movie, is that these films have the weirdest structures and the weirdest kind of narrative, kind of diversions in a way that I've ever seen. But there's something kind of fascinating about them. Just start us off, Matt, by telling us what's your history with the first film, and what do you think of the first film, and then what do you think of this movie in comparison?
Okay, so the first film I saw April this year, I downloaded it to my phone so I could watch it on a flight, which is such a travesty.
Oh my God. That is not the way to watch this film.
It's so not. But it is a testament to the film that I still found it absolutely chilling and incredible. I just loved it. And of course, I knew all about the opening set piece, because that is the stuff of horror legend, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And we've seen that obviously influencing so many things that have come since it. And, we've got the urban legend that it was inspired by, or vice versa. I don't know what was the egg or the chicken in that situation. But, we have, of course, Scream, the callers in the house. It's just a well-worn trope at this point. But even though I knew of that, I was so shaken by the revelation at the end of that scene that he actually kills the kids. I never knew that was where it was going to go. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect it to have the balls to go there. And I kind of always thought there would be, the police were going to arrive safely, kids are escaped, but then, he comes back later in the film, and that's where the joke goes. I had no idea that what was to come was going to be like this whole other different movie in the middle of it, where suddenly we're following completely different characters, and the killer almost becomes our point of reference for emotion, empathy, and it's so strange. But I really loved it, and I loved it for how refreshing that structure was, because it's not something that has been really copied since, I don't think.
No. And I think partly because it wasn't very successful with people. I don't think people even now speaking to people about this film, everyone's like, the common opinion, right, is amazing opening scene, don't bother with the rest of the film about that first one, which I think is a shame. I personally disagree with. I think the whole film is fucking weird and creepy and unnerving and queasy and sleazy. I loved it. I loved the whole thing. And I came to this movie having never seen it until like literally this week. What about you, Matt? Had you seen the sequel until now?
Same here. No, this was a first time watch. I got to say, I knew of it. It wasn't high up on my watch list because I didn't know anything about it other than it kind of looks like a straight-to-TV movie from the artwork. And, of course, we know it is, but I didn't know that. I just thought, oh, that poster looks a bit cheap, and I've never had anyone really rate it, so I probably won't rush for it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Thank you. You've made this really queue jump.
Right, exactly. And so what did you think of it, and how did it compare to the first one?
Oh, Mike, I loved it so much.
Yes. I'm so glad. I was worried you were going to say you hated it then.
No, this is so good. It is so strange and weird and absurd. And okay, let's start with that opening because I kind of, at the beginning, you think, okay, here we are again. We're going to do this again, are we? But it goes in a very different direction, and it plays that same scene out with equal, if not better, terror and suspense. And there were moments in this opening where my blood ran cold and I felt all my hackles go up. I had to pause it at one point and rewind it because I just couldn't believe what was going on. It's masterful, absolutely masterful.
Fred Walton has suddenly now shot up to be one of my favourite horror filmmakers because both of these films do something to me. Particularly the opening scenes in both. How did he manage to pull that off again? Even the Scream movies only pulled off that incredible opening once, really. Right? Never again have they achieved an opening scene that is as has as much terror in it as the opening scene of Scream 1. This movie did it twice in a row, and I had, same as you, zero expectations for a film called When a Stranger Calls Back from 1993, straight to video, straight to TV, in a notoriously bad time for horror. I was like, I have no expectations or high hopes for this. And straight away, that opening sequence, I'm like, well, this is some of the best horror I've seen in ages, right? It's absolutely brilliant. It's so good. And you're right, it's similar enough to the original, but it's doing something really different. The talking through the door rather than on the phone is a really interesting twist on the first film, right? Where this guy who's saying, and this is something that we've covered in the Home Invasion series, even in A Clockwork Orange, this idea of my car's broken down, I need to come in and use your phone. And this main character who very smartly doesn't let him in, never wants to let him in, and has to find ways to kind of appease him and get rid of him. And it's so tense because you're watching her kind of pretend to call the whatever they are, like the AA equivalent, and the way that it takes its time. This is what I love about Fred Walton's direction. Really takes its time. These scenes are slow. Like you said, it's like 20-25 minutes. It's like a third of the runtime of the movie. It's not just an opening scene, right? And it's masterful, again, in the way that it builds. Yeah. So good.
It's magnificent. And what is so clever about it is that Fred Walton is playing with our expectations because he knows we've seen the first film. Yeah. He knows we know what to expect. But he kind of pulls the rug out from us at every turn. Even just like the first thing we get is when she's left at home, the parents have gone out of these kids, they've gone out to their dinner or whatever, and the phone rings. So she picks up the phone immediately. Oh, here we go. Here's our stranger. But we don't actually hear the speaker on the other end of the phone. So immediately I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, that can't be scary because we can't hear his voice. We're just seeing this one-sided conversation, and there's something different going on here. Yeah, because what brings the fear is hearing what the killer is saying to you, isn't it? Surely, and then when we get that knock at the door and he turns up, it's not the same as in the last movie where he immediately sounds very creepy. Yes. He sounds like a really articulate, nice, well-meaning guy in what is clearly, she's in a beautiful home. It's obviously a very affluent neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, you know, you kind of, let me ask you, Mike, did you at any point question whether the guy out the door was actually going to be the antagonist or not? Because I believed him at points. I believed, oh my God, he's really just asking for our help. There's something else going on here.
No, I completely agree. I agree with you. I thought, oh, is it going to subvert what we expect? And is it going to turn out he is just some poor guy that needed to be let in? And is it going to turn out to be that if she had let him in, he could have helped her because actually the killer is inside the house and not outside the front door, right? Yeah. But it takes you on that journey, because then I was like, oh no, he is a wrong one. Oh, is he? And then of course, the thing that I was really impressed with in this film is how, like, me and Stevie spoke about it last week, how in the first film, that beautiful, masterful cinematography where you're always putting kind of Carol Kane on one side of the frame, and you kind of find yourself looking at what's going on in the background at shadowy staircases, and you're looking at everything constantly to see, is something going to move, is something going to happen? And I think this movie actually like works that into the story, right? Like it is a whole film about, oh, that book wasn't on that shelf before, and you know, that window wasn't open before. And this movie, this opening scene does that, where it's like the message on the fridge has disappeared, and it makes you key in on these little details because you're constantly thinking, is somebody in the house messing with her?
Yes.
So that was just so good about it as well, that it was actually like working in that kind of paranoia that the first one gave us. And then also, you know, in a slightly silly way when it turns out that the killer is a ventriloquist. But I did really love this idea as well of Fred Walton is deliberately playing with our senses too, of like, where is this voice coming from? Is it coming from the other side of the door? Like you said, this time we don't hear conversations on the phone. We only hear voices that are in the actual vicinity, but we don't know where they are in the vicinity. And that's kind of the fun of this very, very silly setup of this killer that can like supernaturally throw his voice around. But I was into it. I was like, this is amazing. I loved it. I loved all of that detail, you know, because again, it was more about Fred Walton just kind of messing with our senses and what we can see and hear around us, you know.
It really works actually quite well with headphone watching as well, because it does actually, you've got that surround effect.
Amazing.
It kind of works in stereo in that way. It's so smart, isn't it? And this opening it's the back and forth where so what we didn't say is that the phone, when she goes to make the phone call to call their equivalent of the AA to help him get his car fixed, the phone's dead and there's no network. So she kind of, rather than going back and saying to him, hi, I can't make the phone call because the server's out, you know, because maybe that in itself is also, you know, she's already wary. She's not opening the door to him. She's talking to him through the door. She doesn't want to tell him that she can't make a phone call in case she needs the emergency services. She's giving him an open invitation. So instead, she goes back and says, I've called them. They'll be here in an hour. Don't worry. Yeah, please leave. Go off and wait for them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, an hour passes. No one's come. So he's back at the door. And this is, you know, we have the reference of the clock, and we know throughout this scene we keep getting shots referring back to the time. We know that the parents, the owners of the house, are going to be back at 11:30, and we see the camera at 15:15. So we know that if she can just stick this out for another 15 minutes, she can bugger off and she'll be fine. But it keeps building and building with him returning, and to the point where he kind of gets angry and he calls her out, and you're, as a watcher, you're thinking, you're tripping yourself up in your own lies. You keep pretending to make these phone calls, but you're not actually doing it.
It's so hard, because actually there was one point when I was like, what are you doing? Just tell him the phone isn't working. Stop pretending to call people. But you're absolutely right. And then I realized a minute later, I'm like, no, she can't tell this potentially dangerous stranger, I don't have any means of communication to the outside world, right? She can't admit that she has no phone and couldn't call the police if she needed to.
She's completely vulnerable.
So it does make sense. It does make sense as to why she would need to sort of pretend to have these conversations on the phone. But it's interesting, isn't it? Was he I would need to watch the film again to figure this out, but at what point does he get into the house? Was he there? Was he inside the whole time and throwing his voice to make it sound like it was outside? Or is there a moment when he crawls in through the window and gets in?
So it's really unclear, isn't it? Because there's this
Yeah.
discussion after about the window being open by 6 inches, isn't it, there? But at no point do we really see her unlock the door and leave it open, or him sneak in. I knowing what you find out at the end of the film about this killer and how he hides in plain sight, I would really like to watch this again to see if what would have been great would be if he was hidden throughout some of these scenes, in the periphery or behind certain objects, clever kind of framing of the shots. I don't know if there is any of that in there. I can't imagine there is, but it would be great if they had done that.
Yeah.
It is a bit. It's a little bit hazy on some of those intricacies, isn't
But
it?
I love that. I think I love that this is something I loved about the first one too, is that you don't really know what this guy's deal is, why he's doing what he's doing. Why in the first film did that guy like mutilate children with his bare hands? Like, what the fuck? And in this movie, it's even more of a what the fuck? What is this guy's MO? Like, what the hell is he doing?
Oh, God,
what does he actually want in this opening scene? Does he want her to let him in so that he can murder her? So that he can, kidnap the children? We never know what happens to the children.
We don't ever get an outcome. There's no resolution to the children going missing, is there?
And I love it. This is what I loved about these films, is that like everything is kind of quiet and subtle and ambiguous, where you just like, you get to the end and you're like, what the fuck just happened? What did I just watch? You know, it's really nightmarish in that regard.
Just on that opening, but it is the bit for me though where he goes to her, final knock on the door. I'm not asking for your help. I need you to know that I think there's someone in the house with you.
So good.
And that is the point where you think that is the bit, because at this point I'm still doubting, the audience is still doubting whether he's genuine or not.
Yeah.
And that's when you think, holy fuck, is he genuine? And he's trying to help her out. He's spotted someone through the window. I've seen a shadow and now he's in there. I think you need to get out.
Yes.
And she runs upstairs, spots the kids are gone, runs back downstairs, opens the door, and there's just his jacket on the
That's fucking
porch,
weird as well. That's fucking weird.
as if a ghost has just, he's been raptured on the spot. Like, he's just...
What? I was like, what's that? Why is there just a jacket there? What does that mean?
Then she shuts the door, turns around, and there he is. He's in the house with her. And that's a really strange image, because it's just this dark figure.
Yes, just kind of like Frankenstein walk towards
ghoulishly. It is Frankenstein, isn't it?
And of course, it's that moment beforehand where he says, "Look to your right" or whatever. And so you're led to believe that there are two of them working in tandem at this point, right?
yeah, that's it. And that's one of the theories that later on the detective is positing, isn't he?
Yes.
Were there two killers, one inside, one outside?
And then, of course, that's when you get, maybe he can throw his voice. Genius. I love it. But I think...
Which I guess was through the 6-inch crack in the window. His voice could carry through that window into the living room.
Bonkers. I don't know, but I'm into it. I was so happy to just go along with that. Great, he's a ventriloquist. I've never seen that before. Brilliant, let's do it.
No.
Where are you? What have you done with them?
I'm hiding in the bushes.
Why?
He's in there with you. Look into the living room.
Also, sort of, as silly as it is, I think it also corrects some of the mistakes of the first one that people... Well, at least some of the problems people had with the first one, which is this idea that beyond that opening scene, we're in a completely new story with new characters. Like, this movie at least retains Julia from the opening scene. She's kind of in it throughout, teamed up with Carol Kane's character, Jill. I love all the J's. Jill, John, and Julia, right, are our three protagonists.
It's a nightmare for anyone trying to discuss this, isn't it?
Bonkers, absolutely bonkers. But it does feel a bit more of a coherent whole, I think, this movie. And I actually, once again, really loved this middle act of this film, which is very quiet, very understated. Her getting back to her flat 5 years later, Julia, and seeing like that baby's sweater hanging up in her wardrobe, and just like those little details of someone has been in my apartment and has fucked with my stuff, or left something where it shouldn't be, or moved something where it shouldn't be. Again, it's very subtle. It's not big and showy, but the horror in this is the kind of horror that I love. You know, I thought all of that section was brilliant, and you know, Carol Kane coming in and saying, yes, I believe you, and you should look out for this, and this is a red flag, and this is a red flag, and you know, I loved all that stuff. You know,
we're with Julia while she reckons with her experience here, aren't we? As it starts to reappear in her life, and she's faced with it again, and it is a bit strange that Carol Kane has her character has developed quite a bit. She's gone in a different direction to where we last saw her. But yes, it's kind of beautiful. And I really begrudge having to say this, but there is a big trauma storyline in the center of this movie. And it is, Carol Kane's character of Jill is Laurie Strode in H2O. Yes. As she is someone who's been through it. She's trying to impart her knowledge and survive herself. Yeah. She's not just helping Julia get through her experience now, because Jill is living it with her. There's a scene where they're talking about, Jill and the detective are talking about her having to defend herself. And she says, what else can she do? What else can any of us do? Yeah. And that line is so to me, that was just, this is about her as much as it is about Julia, as much as it is about any woman suffering violence or threat at the hands of a man, because they are, again, like the last film, we have got these women coming together, and she's the only one who believes her fully, just without question. Yeah. All of the men, all of the detectives and policemen who interview Julia question her story. Yeah. Yeah. And Jill just takes it at face value and says, I get you, I hear you. We're going to go get you a fucking firearm and take you to the shooting range so you can look after yourself, which is, okay, hey, it's America, but...
I know. Turns out that gun wasn't the best idea. But anyway, it's great. I love that dynamic that the two of them have. And, you know, again, it's the little details of the home itself in these films. You know, the fact that Carol Kane's character lives in this big, sort of sparse open plan apartment, and she talks about that herself, right? She's like, it's probably that people like us, you know, don't have clutter, we don't have dark corners and nooks and crannies where people can hide. Everything is brightly lit and on display and very meticulously ordered so you can see if anything has moved or changed. And I love the conversations they have together. That moment when Julia wakes up in the night, she thinks she sees something in her window, and her first instinct is to call Jill, and Jill talks her through it, right? And it's like, stay on the phone to me, go and check this room, go and check this, go and check. And it's like, it's like smart women doing the smart things in these movies is kind of really satisfying to see, and it doesn't diminish the horror. It's still fucking terrifying, you know? It's great. Yeah. So that stuff I thought was really great. And then, of course, it starts going bonkers early 90s horror film, because then it's like, what if there was one person in that house initially and not two? And what if the killer can throw his voice? Therefore, we're looking for a ventriloquist. And then we move to the weird part of the movie where we're in like a sleazy sort of cabaret bar. I don't even know what that place is, actually. It's very strange.
A topless bar which hires ventriloquists to do dummy performances. It's with really kind of like, again, very expensive looking clientele. Like, wherever it is, I want to be there.
Yeah, I know, right? What is this location they're in? I loved it. Yeah. And we spend a bit of time with the killer, and he is like as much a weird, creepy enigma as the killer in the first movie, really. But like, there's something even weirder about this guy, of course, and it's the way that he's basically like blacked up as well. But he's got his whole face coated in black makeup because he's supposed to be staying hidden in the dark, right, as well. But so you can never actually really see his face.
It's very much like theatrical paint, isn't it? Like that he's using. It really brought to mind for me the guy who is in the waiting room of Beetlejuice who died from smoking. He looks like that because all there are the whites of the eyes and the rest of it is just vacant. And we don't spend a lot of time with the killer in this one, nowhere nearly as much as the last killer. I call him a killer. He's not technically a killer. I don't think we ever actually see him kill anyone, do we?
That's a really good point.
So
yeah, that's a really good point.
The stranger or the stalker. But we don't see a lot of him. I think the most of what we get of his person and his MO, if he really has one, is through this ventriloquist performance he does.
That's so great, that scene. So good.
This is something. I was screaming at this. I just could not believe what I was seeing.
Dark, angsty performance. It's so good.
Because at this point as well, when the detective said earlier, I believe our stalker's a ventriloquist. This is going to sound crazy, but I think he's a ventriloquist. I thought, oh, yeah, that's stupid. Of course it's not that. So I still didn't believe this until we see, they are introducing a ventriloquist. That's where we're going. Okay.
Unbelievable.
And he has a performance. His dummy is completely faceless. And he does this kind of avant-garde spoken word soliloquy about basically being no one. He's on the fringe of society. He's a nobody. He has no identity. He can morph. He can adapt into anything. And then, he kind of throws some shade at some of the boys in the audience who are laughing at him. He says, yeah, you look in the toilet and, your reflection. Like, okay.
It's so good. It's so good. In the middle of this, sleazy,
mad.
Whatever it is, peep show bar or something. It's just amazing.
So abstract and unforewarned. I was not prepared.
I want to, like you said, I want to go to this bar. I want to see this performance.
One of my favourite things is when the performer for this obviously quite divisive performance, which wasn't necessarily right for this venue. The manager comes out and drags him out the back and basically fires him on the spot in the backstage room, and he's meanwhile responding without moving his lips, throwing his voice as he's having this argument with the manager. And
so good. I loved it. It's so weird. And then that moment when he's about to go use the toilet that's just in the middle of the dressing room, and she's like, it's been blocked for 3 days or something as well. And it's it's just again, this weird, what world are we in this town, in this neighborhood? It's amazing. Absolutely incredible. And then we get the final act, which again is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever seen in my life, but I absolutely loved it when he's revealed to be hiding in the wall of Jill's apartment, disguised as a wall. Basically, it was this is the best thing I've ever seen in my life.
It is perfect. What's that show where the makeup shows like Glow Up or something? He should be on one of them. He's managed to apply this full body paint to himself, which matches up with every brick crevice, and there's some kind of wooden paneling in the wall that he's also painted down himself. So he just blends in immaculately, and it looks astonishing, doesn't it? It is so jarring to see. It's also absolutely ludicrous to think he could have done that without someone's help.
Just thrown it together. I love it. Did you ever watch Spaced, Matt?
I didn't, no.
No, because people listening will know what I'm talking about, but there's a moment in Spaced when Brian, Mark Heap's character, who was an artist, a body artist, and there's a moment when they will walk into his flat looking for him, and he's just in the background disguised as a wall, and it just immediately made me think of that. I'm like, this is artistic genius. I absolutely love it. But yeah, it's a bonkers final showdown, but I was just absolutely here for every second of it. I loved it so much. It was amazing. And also, there are some really weird, disturbing moments. Everything that happens to poor Julia is really dark, right? The fact that does she shoot herself in the head? We never quite know whether she did that to herself or whether the stranger did it to her, right? Yeah. But then she's in hospital, and that weird scene when the stranger comes in and starts punching her while she's in a coma in hospital. What the fuck is that scene? It's horrible.
And it never gets referenced. after that, it's just so dark, isn't it? And this hospital room is completely like, there's only one tiny like reading light above the bed, so it's completely in shadow. And he's in there before Jill comes to visit. Jill comes, pays her some time, and then leaves. And he just steps forth, and it is really disturbing. Later, we find the detective makes his way. They track him down to his apartment, don't they? And they find all of his Polaroids.
Yes.
And there's just bits and snags of clothing, something like a blue piece of material that Julia was holding, and photos of her as he's basically undressed her in that hospital bed and
what the
taken
fuck?
snaps. Why is he doing this? And how does this, connect with the child kidnapping?
Right.
What is driving him? It's terrifying for us not knowing.
I love it. I love that we don't know and that it doesn't explain any of it. It's who knew, right? Who knew this would be such a underrated horror gem, this weird little cheap little movie from 1993. But I was really into it. I really loved it. And as silly as it gets, I think that the direction is so good, and I think generally these performances are so good as well that I was just like fully engrossed. I was such a fan.
Oh, I can't agree more.
Well, there you go. Is there anything else you want to mention on this movie? I mean, like, I don't know how much more there is to say about it, really, but is there anything we've missed?
I guess just to some of the 90s-ness of it. I mean, like, it is very much of its time. And it is, down to Julia sporting in the opening scene a Demi Moore from Ghost hairdo. And then, of course, we have to quickly mention that mullet that she has 5 years later. That wig that she's in is just top-notch. It's so very in that vein of the early 90s thriller procedural, and it's kind of coming hot off the heels off of Silence of the Lambs, which was 91. This is 93, and I'm getting a lot of that, particularly with Carol Kane's portrayal of Jill. That is a very Jodie Foster-esque role, isn't it? In that she's giving us Clarice Starling. Even the poster art is Jill holding the gun. It looks like a still from that movie, so you can see that they've kind of tried to cash onto that trend. Because that's where audience we're going for their horror fix at this time, weren't they?
Absolutely.
I loved it. So really glad that you selected this film. I feel like I've really lucked out on that.
I know, me too. I listened to a lot of people who recommended it to me, and I'm so grateful that so many people did. It's genuinely great, and I do think that these two movies as a pair they both have their flaws. But as in like the first When a Stranger Calls and the second one, they both have their flaws, but between them they have some of the best tension and scariest set pieces I've seen in a very long time. I think that like these are really my type of horror movies. Like they are quiet and understated, but then they are not afraid to hit you with true terror when it's needed. And it's just I really loved both of them, rewatching them both these last couple of weeks. It's been awesome.
Top notch.
So there you go. Well, Matt, thank you so much. What a joy it's been to have you on the podcast finally and discuss these movies. I've got a couple of final wrap-up questions for you. First of all, in this weird subgenre of home invasion, and you can be as kind of creative as you want with this, but what is your favourite home invasion movie?
I think broadly, if we stick to pure home invasion, which I know you're not covering them in this series because you've already done them, but it's those French extremity ones for me. Martyrs is just, in my book, one of the greatest films ever made. And I tend to lean towards defining great films by how much they can extract emotion and shock from me. And that nothing has ever done so in the way that Martyrs did. So, that is what I would look at for more kind of typical fare.
Perfect.
But I also really love like wall person horror, and for me something like, can I call Clive Barker's Hellraiser a home invasion movie? I
love that.
Frank Up in the Attic was actually one of the first things I knew about Hellraiser, because I remember my mum saying that she'd watched Hellraiser that night and there was a man with no skin in the attic, and that set my mind alight for years. So I'll go with that.
That's an amazing answer. Yeah, that's such a good point, because it is a kind of, Hellraiser is a very difficult one to put in any category or genre, the original Hellraiser, right? It's like, is it a slasher? Is it a monster movie? Is it a home invasion? But you're right. I mean, so much of the film, when I picture that first film, I picture that house and Frank in the attic and Julia looking over the banisters at people downstairs and everything, you know? And it's so much about the geography of that house.
And it's so much about creating an entrance to another dimension, which enters your house through the box, right? So, you know, intruders, the Cenobites are home invaders effectively. Ones
So
that maybe
good.
we've
I love that.
invited by accident.
Yes, exactly. I love that. And then finally, Matt, which I have to ask all my new guests, what is your favourite horror movie?
It's favourite Nightmare on Elm Street. It's the one that I return to without fault. I just adore it and can watch it any time of day. Not necessarily the best horror movie, but it's my favourite.
Perfect answer. I mean, what a film, right? It is absolutely perfect. Do you think that we'll ever would you ever want to see another Nightmare on Elm Street film, Matt? And, you know, would you think it's a series that should be ever resurrected, rebooted?
I'm really open to it. I mean, it is really difficult with that film because so much of Freddy is Robert Englund, and we've seen how it works in the remake we shall not speak of. But I would be so open to it and open to another actor if it can just be, you know, put together with vision, with creativity, and we're getting some great reinvigorations of franchises at the moment, aren't we? So I think it's possible, but it just needs the right team behind it and the right people who really love it and do it for the right reasons. I'll never say no.
No, exactly. Matt, so thank you so much for joining me. Just tell people where, if they want to come and find you online, if they want to come and find and listen to more of you, where can they find you? Cool.
Well, if you're not already listening to Stevie's Brain Rot, you totally should be. So come and check out that. I've done an episode on his last series covering 80s Trash Fest Hobgoblins, which was wonderful fun. And sign up to his Patreon if you want to hear some more every month. You can also follow me on my Instagram. I am at Draper's Discs, where you can see my horror vinyl collection, which is always growing, much to the dismay of my partner and our limited home space. Or you can follow my letterboxd at Draper Did That.
Amazing. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Cheers for having me, Mike. It's been an absolute honour.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Matt Draper. Loved having Matt on the podcast. Hopefully he will be back again soon. So let us know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of these two bonkers films, especially When a Stranger Calls Back. I'm so keen to know what people made of it, especially if they watched it for the first time for this episode. So you can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord. If you want to support this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content and more, sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So we are going to take a couple of weeks off. We're going to have a little mid-season break, but we won't be gone for long. We'll be back in the next 2 or 3 weeks for the next part of our home invasion season. And next time, things are going to get much, much darker. Next episode, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Dan Martin, and we are going to be discussing 2 controversial and disturbing movies from the 1980s. First of all, Angst from 1983, then Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer from 1986. What a fun double bill. Join us again soon for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.